Okay, Lynn, take it away.
Okay, well, I just want to welcome everyone to tonight's installment of Beth Jacobs Got Talent. And I'm here with two very impressive women who happen to be very close family members. My mother, Rosalie Zales, and my sister, Shelley Zales. Shelley is a CEO and entrepreneur, and she does things that I've never quite understood what she does. During her whole career, I've tried to figure it out, and I'm hoping by the end of this evening, after our conversation, I'm going to know exactly what she does. But I do know that she's a champion of women and gender equality in the industry, in the advertising and marketing industry. Has so many accolades and honors and what else can we say about Shelley? Accolades, honors. She's a lecturer at universities, I believe the University of Pennsylvania. She's a very much in demand speaker. And then there's my mother, who is a legend. I think a lot of people know my mother. She's a legend in the Jewish community, not just in Los Angeles, but I would say in the world. And so many Jewish causes and activities are so close to her heart. And she's been all of our role models, not just for me and my sisters, but I think for many people in this community. She's also a teacher, a community activist, and she was a senior policy advisor for Governor Pete Wilson. She's also a tremendous speaker. I'm sure some of you have heard my mom speak over the years. So both my mother and sister are wives and mothers and career women. They're feminists. They're both motivational speakers, as I said. They're both activists for change, and they're both leaders. But when I was thinking about this tonight, I was thinking, but they both make tremendous impact in the community, but they come from very different eras, clearly, very different backgrounds, and they've had very different influences in their lives. And of course, they have very different goals and they've taken very different paths. And I thought that's what I wanted to hear about tonight. So the first question I have.
Lynn, could I jump in for a second?
Yes.
So I know we're doing it a little bit out of order and you just gave a beautiful introduction to your mom and sister, but if I could just take 30 seconds to give a little rabbinic introduction, just to thank you, to thank the three of you for participating in this, just what promises to be a fascinating discussion. I'm very excited about this Beth Jacobs Got Talent series because we're going to be showcasing the life stories and unique experiences of our Beth Jacob members. And so that's the context of this series and of this evening, which is the kickoff event of this series. And I want to thank our president, John Stern, for envisioning this concept. And personally, I'm always so impressed by our members who are not only so dedicated Jewishly, but incredibly accomplished in their respective fields. And generally speaking, making such a difference in the world. So tonight is just going to be an amazing discussion because it's a powerhouse mother, daughter, and daughter combination. The Zales family are not only, a major force at Beth Jacob, but have made a real major mark on the world. And it's kind of like this mother-daughter, this continuity of tradition in the family of a passion to make a difference is something that for me is a theme of the evening. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Rosalie is just one of a kind, amazing lady. We miss Ed tonight. But Rosalie, we wish you strength and good health and happiness. And of course, Lynn and Shelley, each amazing, one of a kind in their own way as well. So thank you so much for that, for allowing me to jump in there, Lynn, and please take it away. And thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your experiences and insights on your lives. And I'm sure it's going to be very meaningful for all of us.
Thanks, Rabbi. So Mom, I'm going to start with you. And I was just thinking about some of the great things you've done. Like you taught Barbra Streisand in New York, high school English, I believe. You were a journalist and you interviewed Elie Wiesel, who's one of my heroes. You were the president of, on every board, of every organization in Los Angeles, the president of many of them, a founding activist of many organizations in Los Angeles, senior policy advisor to the governor of California. But my first question for you is, what would you say are some of the highlights of your career? If you could only choose a few.
Well, I would have to say that when I went back to work, there was one thing that was uppermost in my mind. I stayed home to raise my 4 daughters, and when my youngest went to high school and the older 3 were in college, I knew it was my time to go out there and do the things that I had been working for as a volunteer. And the single driving factor is any job that I ever took, the first question I said, can I make an impact on the Jewish community? Can I do something to help the Jews and to help Israel? If I couldn't, I wouldn't accept it. I wouldn't even consider it. And so my first job in journalism, of course, was highlighting congressmen and senators. I would go to Washington with my cameraman, and I interviewed every member, I would think, of the United States Congress, both senators and most of the representatives. And then the interviews that I did with them were print journalists and also on air television. And the question I always asked them, leading questions always, were putting in a little bit about how important Israel was to the state of Israel and then important to America. And then I would ask them questions, and then their interviews, they were always very happy with their interviews, and they would be sent all over the country to all the people who supported them and all their would-be supporters. So in many ways, that was a way of getting the message of supporting Israel out to everybody. And then, of course, my second major job after working in 2 presidential campaigns where I focused on the Jewish community and U.S.-Israel relationships, that was the campaigns of 2 would-be presidents.
That was Ronald Reagan
and George Bush the elder. And it was very important for me to be in those positions as well. And then ultimately I did a lot of television, which I always pressed. And I think one of the highlights that I remember from my days on television, I was a weekly guest on a sort of a Meet the Press of California. And they had 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And there was a guy on by the name of Patrick Cadell. I don't know if you remember him. He worked for Jimmy Carter and he worked for a lot of Democrats. They always had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I used to be frequently a panelist with Arianna Huffington when she was still Arianna Huffington and she was still a Republican. So we were the 2 Republicans, and you had major people who were in the Democratic Party. And Patrick Cadell, I don't remember what the question was, what the moderator, some non-really major important question about the Middle East. And he went into an anti-Israel diatribe. I was stunned, and it was my very first time on the show. And I was so stunned because I was new. And of course I wanted to stay on the show. It was good. I was working for the governor at the time. It was good for him to have me there as a voice of what we were doing. But I was so overwhelmed by this that when he finished this horrible, malevolent diatribe about everything was wrong with Israel, they were subjugating all these people and taking their land away, and they were imposters, and because of the Holocaust, they came and thought they could have everything, let them go somewhere else. And I just was aghast. And I looked at him and I said to him, excuse me, it wasn't even my turn, I butt in. When's the last time you visited Israel? And he says, I've never been to Israel. And I said to him, well, if you've never been to Israel, I don't think you know enough to talk about Israel the way that you just did, or any other way. And I said, I've been to Israel 26 times. Let me tell you about Israel. Let me tell you about the history. And everybody was quiet. The panel was quiet. The audience was quiet. And I went into a whole history.
Okay, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about your career, and I said you were a journalist. You started off, though, you were hired to sell ads for Israel Today.
Right.
So you were selling ads for
I never sold that.
not selling ads, but.
I never sold a single
Oh,
ad.
you never, okay, so you weren't successful at selling ads,
No,
but
I
you
never
were hired
tried.
to sell.
I never tried to sell ads.
But anyway, you
Yeah.
were hired to sell ads, I think. And about a month later, or a few weeks later, you were packing your bags and you were flying to Israel. And I said, what are you doing? Where's mom going? You said you're going to interview Menachem Begin for Israel Today. So you went from being hired to do one thing, and suddenly you were interviewing Menachem Begin in the Knesset.
Correct.
So that says a lot about you and the kind of person you are and how you take something and turn it into something.
Wow.
And I want to take that and segue to Shelley, because And we're going to hear a lot more about your highlights, but
No, I just want to
Yeah.
finish this. This was very important because afterwards the guy came over to me, Patrick Cattell came over to me. He said, "You will never be on this show again." And of course it ended up I was on every week and he was hardly ever on again.
Okay.
So that was very important to stand up for what you believe in. To me, it was not like going to see Menachem Begin or interviewing Elie Wiesel, interviewing all these fabulous people. To me, that was more important than what I did with those famous people.
Well, if you were to talk about your highlights, it could take many, 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 many hours. So I'm going to segue for a second to Shelley, because like Mom, you're also, where's Shelley? Shelley, you're also a trailblazer. Is that the word? A trailblazer. And you also take, it could be a small thing or a tiny opportunity and spin it into gold. So let's hear about some of your highlights of your career, or some breakthroughs, some ceilings you broke, some innovations, something along those lines.
I love seeing you as a moderator. I think this is actually really fun, and it's kind of hard to follow Mom, truly, because Mom has inspired all of us. And as everyone has heard, my mother doesn't take no for an answer. And one of her most famous lines is she can, get anyone to do anything, even through a phone. It's always a yes, and finding the solution to every problem. And as Lynn talked about selling ads, my mom didn't want to sell ads. She put herself right in the position that she wanted to be, and no one gave her permission. She just took it, and she was that. And so I think that really is the whole story of my career. I started in an entry-level market research job, and I had this big idea to pioneer online research in a day and age where only wealthy old men with broadband were on the internet. And I was so used to getting no, it's not the right time. No, you're not the right one. No, the opportunity just isn't there. And no, there's no room for women in business because it's truly a boys' club. And, of course, the one thing my mother taught all 4 of her daughters was believe in yourself. It's all about confidence, because if you don't believe in you, no one else will. And so I had to always find a solution and zig and zag and find the yes without permission and with no apology. And so I went off to pioneer online research. And this is where Lynn says she doesn't know what I do. Still 35 years later, being in business, my sister does not know what I do. But that's also our work, does not define us. It really is about who we are and how we give back and how we are part of a community. That is the most important thing that, we've all been raised to know and believe. And so when I had this idea to migrate research from telephone and from mall intercept, of course, all my bosses, male bosses, told me it wasn't the right time. A week later, I was on a panel with the chief research officer of Procter & Gamble, one of the largest corporations in the world. And I was on the dais with him speaking, and I'm whispering, to him. And I come off the stage, and my bosses, 5 men, say, "What did you talk to him about?" I said, I just asked him when it was the right time to come to Procter & Gamble and propose moving to online. And all my bosses said, "Well, what did he say?" And I said, he said, "Come next week." And so they said, "Well, Paul will go, John will go, Ringo will go, and Star will go." And I'm like, "Well, what about Shelley?" And they said, "Well, it's a boys' club." And I said, "Well, if I'm not going, I'm going to cancel the meeting, and you can all wait for the right time." And that was really the beginning of my career. I left to pioneer online research. I led the fastest growing research company in the world. I sold it a few years later, and that was that moment. I was the only female CEO, top 25. I realized it was time to help other women rise the ranks to leadership. And that's when I started my new company called The Female Quotient, which is all about advancing women and advancing equality in Fortune 500 companies. And Ariana Huffington is still around. She has recreated herself several times. And I was recently with her at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, with world leaders. And of course, she brought up Rosalie and remembers you very well, Mom. And she is still an inspiration. We were having a conversation about how do we encourage more women to rise the ranks in leadership, especially when we're still primary caregivers, that work-life balance issue. And she said, "I really don't understand why we do exit interviews in Fortune 500 because everyone's gone. why don't we do entry-level interviews? And then I started thinking, why don't we do life stage accommodation? Because at every stage of our lives, especially as women with families raising our children, if we could accommodate through those life stages, we would all attract and retain the best talent, and we would all thrive literally in the workplace. So that's a short journey.
Okay. Good answer, Shelley.
You know what I do now?
No, we'll discuss it later. I said by the end of the hour, hopefully. I'll know. Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there.
You should encourage people, anyone that has questions, you can.
Okay, not yet. I still want to talk about a few more things. Okay, so the next question I had for both of you is, how does your background inform what you do? And tied to that is, who were your greatest influences?
So my mother was my greatest influence. My mother was one of 7 children, born in Riga. She was brought to this country by her mother and her father, who was a rabbi, the chief rabbi of Riga. And they were brought to this little town, Superior, Wisconsin. She had 2 brothers and she had 3 sisters. And the most fascinating thing is, even though they were a rabbinical, super frum family in the city with hardly any Jewish community, all 5 of them, all of them were college. My mother was a college graduate at the end of the 1920s. It was unheard of. Her 2 brothers went to YU. They became rabbis and lawyers, and all of her sisters were college graduates. So when she married my father, who was part of the very large and important Tarragon family in Baltimore, very involved in the Orthodox Jewish community, she was very surprised that there was a school for boys, which my brother went to, the Talmudical Academy, but she wanted me to have a Jewish education, and there was nothing for girls. So she was really a woman pioneer. She opened a school for me and one other girl. She opened the Beis Yaakov of Baltimore with 2 girls, one other girl and myself. This was in the 1960s, unheard of, in the early and 1940s, early 1940s, 1942. She opened the only Beis Yaakov out of New York. And there were 2 of us for 2 months, and then 3 other girls came. And then some other girls came, and I went ahead with 3 other girls. So there were 4 of us. I went to school with 4 girls in a shul, sort of a shul study, until the 8th grade. And that's how long the Beis Yaakov went. And then we all had to go to public high school. And in public high school, the other girls would go every day back to Beis Yaakov for Hebrew study. And I would go too, but not until after tennis and basketball practice. And, you know, even though I wasn't perhaps as frum in the sense that I played basketball and I mingled with other girls and I wore short pants, I had a big influence, because many Jewish and non-Jewish people at the time had this very constricted view of what an Orthodox Jew was. And I was Orthodox. I kept Shabbos, I kept kosher, I did everything. But I had a life that some people might consider normal. And it was a way for other people, Jewish and non-Jewish, to see that you could be an Orthodox Jew, but you could also excel in normal activities and get along with normal people. And that's always been important to me. I just want to say that influence of my family being so involved in the Jewish community stuck with me. And when people once said to my father, I'll never forget it, you know what, Sapasna, it doesn't look nice that your daughter geht mit kursa hazelach, that your daughter goes around in shorts. Because they knew that I went after school to play basketball before I went to Beis Yaakov to take Hebrew studies. And my father, I will never forget it. He didn't know that I was in the other room and I heard him. He said, my Tochter, that ton asach mehr by the Yiddish folk, then in other words, for those who don't understand Yiddish,
like me,
don't worry. My daughter will do more for the Jewish people, even with her short pants. And when you hear your father say that, how can you not be committed to the Jewish community? My family implanted in me the thought that this was my mission in life. My mission was, whatever I did, the Jewish community in Israel had to come first. And this has been something that's been the driving force in my life.
Wow. Okay, Shelley, same question for you, though I don't think you can top that one.
No, I can't do it in Yiddish, that's for sure. Mani Shana, sort of in Yiddish, since mom does that every Pesach for us. But I think my situation, strangely enough, this is why it's called like mother, like daughter. You know, you don't fall far from, you know, the tree. But for me, it's the same. I mean, I wasn't wearing short shorts, but I was that woman in business that was invisible, and I was never right. And I had to conform to the rules that made no sense, which is how I inherited the nickname Chief Troublemaker. I broke all the rules that made no sense and wrote the new ones so that I could thrive and have a family and a career and be part of a community and still have my girlfriends that I treasure. And also that fifth dimension we always forget about is ourselves. And I had to really start showing that the feminine, Sarah Jessica Parker says, trying to be a man is a waste of a woman. We need men and women in leadership. The masculine, decisive, linear, aggressive, assertive, the feminine, compassionate, nurturing, empathetic, resilient. We need those soft skills that today are, in our opinion, the greatest traits of leadership. And yet we have been hiding them and trying to conform to, you know, the masculine, and that's just not who we are. And so I had to start being that and leading the way and talking about it. I've been told so many times there's no room for emotion in the boardroom, you know, for those soft skills. And so you have two options.
Shelley, what about your going back to the way you were raised, your background and your influences that pushed you to where you are? I mean, was there something in your background? Was it mom maybe? As seeing all the things that mom did during her life that motivated you, or?
Yeah, I first of all, I think that, you know, and so I just wanted to finish that. So the next day I gave a speech to thousands saying bring emotion to the boardroom, so that exception became the new rule. And when I look back in my career, and you know, this is really the truth, I didn't realize this until a few years after I started empowering women to be themselves and bring themselves to the table. I really went back to what you did, Mom, which was the first conference for women for Pete Wilson. And I looked at myself one day and said, I can't believe that now I have this community of women. And you know, one of the things that I remember so well, Mom, what year was that? I think I was 30 years old. I'm now 58, so it was like 28 years ago.
The first women's conference was held in 1991.
And Mom was
Mom created it.
It
ended up with 10,000 people every year.
Right, and I remember women, you know, going from breakout room to breakout room, talking about things that they never would talk about, getting advice from women about, you know, how you have work-life balance and how you fight for your rights and equal pay and all these things. And that was so many years ago. And that's what I'm doing today, which is pretty crazy to know, A, that we haven't made a lot of progress since then, and why we need to, you know, close the gaps that still exist, especially with, you know, working moms and still being primary caregivers.
But again, Shelley, I'm sorry, I keep thinking about parallels between you and Mom. Like, Mom always challenged the status quo, and that's going back so many years before women were challenging the status quo. I forgot your story about the Federation or the...
I want to tell that because it's very important. When I moved here in 1967, I became involved with the Jewish Federation because it was the most visible Jewish organization, in addition to AMEC, where my children went to school, and Shari Tzedek, where we belonged to shul. And I went to the first meeting and I was appalled. They were serving treif. And I couldn't believe that an organized Jewish community would serve treif. I mean, in Baltimore, they didn't serve treif. And then we moved around so much, I was never actually involved in an organized Jewish community, living for a short time in Texas and San Francisco and Germany. And so I went to the head of the Federation, who luckily for me at that time was Barbie Weinberg, who has since become one of my dearest and closest friends. And she was raised in a kosher home. And I said, Barbie, how is it possible that a Jewish federation would serve treif? She says, nobody ever said anything. All these years, nobody ever said anything. I said, well, I'm saying something, and I'm new here, and I want to get involved, and I want to be instrumental in building, but you have to make this place kosher. And luckily for me, a woman in power like she was able to change it. But the thing is, even if we as women can't change something, we have to find a way to find people who can. So nothing is a dead end. There's always an Eitzah, as we say in Yiddish. There's always a way of finding a way to get something done. And from then on, the Federation was kosher. It has to be kosher. Every event has to be kosher. And, you know, one time it was kosher style, but after that, it was kosher. So that's something.
And that's what I mean. You always did that, and Shelley must have internalized that over the years. And because that's what you do.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that's, you know, mom raised all of her daughters to believe they can do whatever they can imagine. But I think another incredible influence for me is mom always creating community. You know, we've moved so many times because dad was in the army, and everywhere we went, mom would create this community. We got connected in the Jewish community even when they were very small, and it was that power of community that I will never forget. Growing up, you know, all of your friends' mom, all of our friends, you know, we would call Mr. and Mrs. And I see Sandy Dimmenstein on Mr. and Mrs. Dimmenstein, like the whole network and the importance of community in our lives. And I felt that was very much missing in Fortune 500. There was no community. I didn't have a community. I always felt alone. And so I decided as a woman, I was the only woman at the top, and I had no one else like me. And I had the choice of conforming or transforming. And so I chose transforming, which is hard. It's hard to break the rules and create a new pack. But now I formed a pack, a community of over 50,000 women globally from Fortune 500 all around the world. I can go to any country in the world and I will have a pack of women that will give me a hug, welcome me, and take care of me. And that's really what I remember, you know, from growing up and what I still feel today. I mean, all of the people, Mom, you brought into our world, our family. And so I've created a family in a very cold world where we never were connected. Women have been so competitive with other women in Fortune 500 because there's such a scarcity of jobs at the top. We've all been set up to compete. And when I was invited to come to the World Economic Forum, which was a really big deal for me, I was so excited. I was invited saying, we want you to come, but you might not be welcome. And so what do? You call your girlfriends and say, you've got to go with me to Davos, Switzerland, because I don't want to go by myself. And 6 years later, we are the destination for equality at the World Economic Forum. But it's because I have a community now that surrounds me and I am never alone. And it is a lot more fun, a lot more impactful. And it's where the change happens.
Okay, so I'm gonna segue again to another question, a little different from what I have written down here in front of me. With everything you've achieved, what would you like to see moving forward, or for people to build on what you've done? Or is that a tough question?
Well, before I get into that, since you brought up Elie Wiesel, I've got to tell
hero.
I've got to tell a wonderful Elie Wiesel story. So when I was fortunate enough to interview Elie Wiesel, the only time he was here for one day, and he knew who I was, and I knew who he was. And when I called him, he said, I want to do the interview, but the only time I can give you, I'm speaking at Northridge in the Valley, and then I'm being driven from Northridge to UCLA. I'm giving a lecture at UCLA, and I'm going right to the airport. I said, I'll take any time you can give me, Mr. Wiesel. So I met him at Northridge, left my car, and we drove from Northridge, and I was interviewing him. It was a wonderful, wonderful interview about motivation. It was really great. I'm sure you can all go online and find it. And then all of a sudden he says to me, I'm sorry, I have to stop this interview. I have to call my son. And his son went to the yeshiva in Brookline, the day school in Brookline. And I'm blocking on his son's.
Alicia,
right, because I've told my kids the story so many times. So all of a sudden I hear him say, Alicia, hello, it's Abba. How did you do on your Chumash test? And I couldn't hear what Alicia said. But what he said was, well, I'm happy you did so well, but was it the highest mark in the class? And I thought that was just so human and so wonderful. And I wanted to put it in the story, but I didn't want to embarrass them, so I didn't. But I told it to everybody.
Mom, that was like you and Dad. If we came home with an A minus, the question was, why didn't we get an A?
So what was your question, Lynn? I forgot.
With all the things you've done, particularly for the Jewish community and for the state of Israel, through your community activism and through politics, what would you like to see happen, or what can we do? And especially for younger people watching.
What I would like to see, and what I'm very worried about, is the disenchantment of the younger Jews, not in the Orthodox community, but in the rest of our communities in terms of Israel. And it frightens me that the professors at the universities today are all so anti-Israel, the BDS movement and all the rest. And I think, to me, AIPAC is the single most important organization. And I'm so happy that all of my children and all of my grandchildren, Shelley takes her whole family to AIPAC. She takes her children and their boyfriends and girlfriends, and she's a major donor, as is Lynn and Mark and myself. And we're all involved in AIPAC and all involved in helping it grow, and the political actions committees affiliated with AIPAC. Because one of my proudest achievements was starting Women's Alliance for Israel, was the first and largest women's pro-Israel PAC in the country, way before we had all these PACs in all the shuls. But to me, this is where we have to give our energy, because we're losing that battle. And we're losing the battle where we have the left wing. I don't want to be political, and I won't be political, but we have to be careful that we don't allow this anti-Israel movement to creep into our political system and to become part of our curriculums in high school and in colleges. And we have to respect everybody. We have to respect people from all spectrums of the world, but people also have to respect us, and they have to respect the Jews and what the Jews have done, not only for America and for medicine and for everything else, but for all of society. And this is my greatest fear. And this is what I really want to think about more intensely and try to figure out avenues to become, so that we can impact the young people in our community who are not fortunate enough to be in families like all of us at the Beth Jacob family and my own family, where all my children and grandchildren are thankfully so pro-Israel.
Wow. Good answer. You should have been like a UN ambassador. Shelley, do you want to take that one too?
Yeah, well, I think we all do the parts that we can in the worlds that we play in. And so for me, I'm very entrenched in, Fortune 500, as we've talked about. And so I bring them to Israel. And, we talk a lot about Silicon Valley being so rich with technology and startups. And I talk about Sabra Alley in Israel. We have some of the best innovation, the best technology in the world. And so when you have companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Colgate and IBM and Visa and Facebook and Google, it is rich. Israel is rich in technology. And so I lead groups, and I see Donna Bender's on, Talia works with me, and we go together and we bring groups to Israel and we show them and showcase different technology so that they'll invest in technology in Israel. Why?
You also teach there, don't you?
I do. I do a lot of work in Israel, and it's my favorite place to go. The women in Israel are incredible, and especially the women in the Tzahal. I mean, they have equal rights to men in the army. It's really quite amazing. And actually, I meet with a lot of women in the army there, and they say, who do you think are the ones they put on the front line? Because we have this ability with sensitivity to be able to read people. We have that female intuition. And so they're always the ones at checkpoints as well, because they have that, inherent sense. And looking at the technology and the inventions that women are creating is remarkable. So I teach, and I also do a lot of dinners bringing women together, and I bring a lot of corporations in Israel.
So before we take questions from the audience, is there anything, Mom, that you want to ask Shelley or say to Shelley Or Shelley, anything you want to ask Mom?
Don't make it too emotional, Mom.
No, I think we'd rather have questions from the audience.
Okay, Shelley?
Yeah, no, so I think if anyone knows how to use their chat, you can.
Where was it?
I'm
Okay, wait, Shelley, we have to tell people to unmute only if they have a question. And we can only hear from people one at a time.
Okay, so let me just manage this part. So 2 ways to send in questions. One, if I see your screen light up, I'll know you want to say something. So if you unmute your screen, you can say it, or you can type it into the chat, which is on the bottom. You'll see a chat little button, and you can type a question in, and I'll be able to pick it up. So,
okay. So I think let's open to questions now.
There are none.
No, hold on. Give everyone a chance.
all right, I'm looking at screen 1. If anyone unmutes their screen, I'll be able to see you. And I'm going to screen 2. Okay, I don't see any questions, and no one is sending. Oh, here's a question coming in. How do women, someone is.
Hi.
There we are.
Shelley, this is Stephanie. I think often what happens is that everyone is very enthusiastic about making a difference and trying to get involved, but they don't really have the catalyst to do that. Can you give us some examples or how we reach out to varying companies or groups to be more involved? For instance, in California, 50% of the boards are supposed to be comprised of women. That isn't happening. So it's known, but how do we get to the next step?
Okay. Shelley, you want to start?
Yeah, so, one of the things that, we're starting to see, like organizations called the 30% Club, where we're looking for at least 30%. We think there's a 30% threshold before we start seeing a transformation of culture on boards. So think about it when you go into a group of 10 people, if you're 1 in 10, you're probably going to be the one that is reserved and holds back because you don't feel that comfortable. So we're trying to create more representation and reflection on boards, but also at every level inside of organizations. And a lot of companies are starting to quota, which is unfortunate to say, we need to quota to get there. And no one wants to be a quota. You want to be invited to the table because you're the best, not because you're filling a quota. But that is how we'll start seeing the balance flipping, by ensuring, and we're starting to mandate that, and companies are being held accountable, not by the CEO of a company, but by the board of directors, to ensure that we have more diversity. And it's not just diversity of gender, race, age, religion, but by having diversity at the table, we have more diversity of thought as well. So we are starting to see more criteria, and we're starting to see in reviews people being held accountable, not just for the return on investment, but also the return on diversity. And that's being put into people's performance reviews to ensure that we fill the table with everything, because that does make the table better.
Okay, Mom, did you want to?
Yeah, I would like to add something to that. I think that women sometimes, I know in my generation, were very insecure about being aggressive. They were always told, don't be aggressive, wait until you're asked. And I found that being aggressive was the way you got things done.
Assertive.
Assertive, no, aggressive.
Really?
Not
Okay.
assertive, aggressive.
Wow.
When I was working for the governor, and one of the important pieces of legislation that I mothered was teaching the Holocaust in the public school system. It was not being taught. And I had to make a compromise because the Black legislators said, well, we're not teaching slavery. We want to teach that too. And I knew that I could never get my legislation. And so I said, fine, we'll amend the legislation, teach the Holocaust and slavery in the public school. And it passed overwhelmingly. Then the question was, how do you teach it? Who wants to sit and read it from a book? And that was the year Schindler's List came out. And I said, aha, I'm going to get a hold of Steven Spielberg, who I know like I know the man in the moon. But I said, I'm going to get to Steven Spielberg and I'm going to have him help me create a curriculum for teaching about the Holocaust. And I called his company, DreamWorks, and I went from this one and this one, and I didn't stop. I kept calling until I found a sympathetic person in the office. And I said, look, I'm the senior advisor of the governor of California. I would like a meeting with Steven Spielberg. And he said, well, can you send me your bio? And well, anyway, it took me 2 months, but I finally got an invitation to have lunch with Steven Spielberg at DreamWorks. So you can imagine how excited I was. So I went to this meeting, and it was Steven and his PR guy and myself. I was the only one. I didn't bring anybody with me. And there was somebody else there. I don't know who that other person was. And they had a kosher lunch for me, which I thought was very touching. Anyway, I talked to him about what I wanted to do. And I said, I'd like to use your movie as a springboard to teach about the Holocaust. He got so excited. He pledged that if I arranged for the buses and the transportation in the 9th grades, he would get the theaters and provide the movie free of charge, and that his company would provide the study books for the show.
Wow.
It was an amazing, he is an amazing person. And we did that. And we went to every school in California. They all had theaters. We went all over the country. And it was remarkable because the first showing was in a school in Oakland that was 90% Black. And when we went on his private plane, and when we got out and we drove to the school, there was all this anti-Israel, all this anti-Semitic stuff all over the neighborhood. And when he got into there, initially he got booed. It was really very interesting. He was shocked by the level of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. He had no clue. This was an education for him.
Wow.
By the time he spoke and he showed the film, he had won everybody over. And he donated a library to that inner city school. And we subsequently showed that film all over the country. And he was instrumental in getting that done. And so I think that it would have been so easy just to give up. But, you know, if you persevere and if you believe in yourself and then you believe in your mission, you will find a way to accomplish it. So I would say to the woman who asked the question, don't give up if you're rebuffed once. Keep trying. If there's a company you want to work for, find a way to get an introduction to that company. Call everybody you know. Call everybody who might be able to help you, but persevere and don't give up.
Okay, another similarity is you two don't lean in, you jump in.
Good one, Lenny. I also, there's a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to pull them in, but I just wanted to...
We'll do shorter answers.
Shorter answers. In your day, Mom.
Short questions, short answers.
Aggressive. Today, women are perceived as too bossy and too aggressive and too assertive. We just changed the lexicon. You're not too bossy. You're the boss. You have executive presence. You're not an introvert. You're just focused and thoughtful. So we're taking the negative to the positive, and that's working quite well. Alex Fleschner, my son, has a question.
Oh.
Alex, if you are on the screen, show yourself. If not, I'm going to read the question for you.
I hope it's for me. Alex, it better be for me.
Okay, let's see. And then I'm going to get to the Shandlings too. So Alex says, Bubby, Lynn, and Mom, my question is, what advice do you have for maintaining these lifelong friendships / relationships that have helped you create the change you've spoken about today?
Well, I continue to be in touch with everybody I have ever worked with. To me, it is very important to keep relationships going. And especially now during this COVID time, I've called people that I haven't spoken to in a year or 2 years. And I just pick up as though it was the same thing. And I keep a very long list of the friends that I've had, the people I've worked with, and I try as best I can. Now, you're not going to be 100%. People move, they die, things happen. But I really try to keep relationships with people that I have worked with or I have known. And I know you tell me often you'll be on a plane and you're sitting next to somebody and they'll say, oh, are you Rosalie's daughter, when they meet you? And, you know, I think I've always talked to my children, Be part of a community. Get involved in your shul. Get involved in your day school. Get involved in Jewish organization. Get involved in professional organization. Get involved in the society in which you work and in which you live and in which you pray. It's very, very important, especially those of us during this time of COVID, realize the importance of friendship and community.
I'm just going to quickly say, because I don't view myself as a community activist the way you are, or an entrepreneur, CEO like Shelley. But so mine is much more micro, Alex. And I feel like what I invested in, the relationships I invested in, aside from my close friends whom I love, and my husband, is my children, my daughters, my grandchildren, and my students. And I gave them everything I had because I loved them so much. Of course, my kids, but my students as well. And I feel that paid off dividends, that they still contact me sometimes. And when I see them, I see the impact, and that reverberates, and the impact on my children and how close I am with my daughters and my grandchildren, and those kind of relationships I hold so dear, as with my mother and my late father and my wonderful sisters.
I was gonna say, don't forget about your sisters.
I know.
And I think that there's nothing more valuable than real friendships. And real friendship, you don't need to call someone every day. You just know they're there. And I see that Essie's on. I think Sherry was on, before, and even, Janie Bodenstein, who I went to elementary school with. That friendship is when you see someone, you're just so happy that they're there, and it feels like just yesterday that you were with each other. And I think that's just the power of a true friendship. It's when you love someone, they're always there. And I think that you give what you get. And I think that we are blessed with wonderful friends. And like Mom, all of your friends are on, and Sandy's on.
I just want to add one thing to this. I think that we have not talked enough about the religious component. And this is, after all, Beth Jacob Zoom. And to me, the continuity of the religious traditions of our families are so important. Friday night dinner, Shabbos, to be together, Yontif, to have the traditions, to bench lifts together, for boys to lay tefillin. It's the connection to their parents, to their grandparents, to their great-grandparents, to the Jewish people. And I think making sure that our children go in Jewish schools, that they're Jewishly educated, that they're part of a Jewish family and a Jewish synagogue and a Jewish tradition, that they're not going to a bar Friday night, but they're going to a Shabbos dinner. I think this is incredibly important in not only who we are, but who our children and our grandchildren and future great-grandchildren become.
And Alex knows that very well because of his relationship with his Zadie. And Shelley and I will just start bawling if we talk about it. But we talk about how precious a relationship is. But I think if Martin Shanling has a question, we need to take it.
Yeah,
he's a VIP. We must. Let's hear.
Do the Shanlings want to ask? Oh, there you are. Do you want to ask it, or do you want me to read it? Unmute if you want to ask.
You do it. You do it, Shelley. You do a better job.
No, you're right.
No, Martin, let's hear it.
Great job unmuting. We want to hear from you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, Rosalie, you mentioned you taught Barbara Streisand. I couldn't let that go without asking for the backstory on that.
Yeah, what's your story about Barbara Streisand?
I graduated from Goucher College in 1957. I was 16 years old. And I decided in Baltimore, there was a very minute, small community of Orthodox people. All the boys went to YU, and there were very few girls, and the few who did went to the Beis Yaakov in Williamsburg. So I was unique in that I played tennis. I was Orthodox, but I was athletic, and I was involved with all kinds of people. So to me, it was very important to go to New York so I could meet Orthodox people in New York. So I applied to graduate school in New York, and I got a job teaching. And it was very hard to get a job right out of high school in a good school in New York, but I got very lucky in a way, and I got into Erasmus High School, which was considered one of the best academic public high schools. And of course, they gave me the worst classes because I was a new kid on the block. So I was an English teacher, but they gave me a drama class because nobody wanted to teach a drama. I knew as much about drama as I knew about the Man on the Moon. So I would teach them plays like they were English. And subsequent to that, one day Barbara Streisand was on one of the talk shows. I think it was Jimmy Fallon or something. And they asked her about if she had ever studied drama. So she said, well, when I was in high school, I had this class with this young lady, this young teacher who was teaching drama. And she was talking about her class with me, which I thought was very funny.
Do you remember her?
I do not remember her. We had classes of 30 to 35, 5 classes.
So she was not a standout in drama class.
She was not a standout in anything. I have no memory of her. But
I hope she's not on this Zoom.
I know.
But I subsequently
Sorry,
I subsequently met her sister, Rosalind Kine, because when I moved here, I tried to get in touch with her through her agent, because I thought I could get her to speak at a women's conference or something. And of course, her agent never returned my call. But then I met Rosalind Kine, and I asked her if she would ask her sister if I was the one who had taught her. My name was Rosalie Tarragon at the time, and she was wonderful. She called me back and said, oh yeah, my sister remembers you. You used to wear little scarves around your neck all the time.
Okay, but when she won an Academy Award, she didn't mention you.
She never mentioned my name.
So you did not make an impact in her life.
No, I did not make an impact.
Sorry to tell you that, Martin.
Lynn, Mom did take you to the Academy Awards, though.
Oh yeah, Mom did take me to the Academy Awards.
And you were so embarrassing because you were actually going over and
okay, we're not talking about that tonight, Shelley. Thank you.
Stalking all these
Okay,
people.
Shelley, are there any more questions?
You're changing the subject.
Because I think we have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, yes, we do have
Or do we not have 5 minutes, Rabbi?
Bob has a question.
Who? I'm sorry?
Rabbi Top has a question.
Yeah, so I don't know about you, but I'm having so much fun. I'm just having a great time, thoroughly enjoying it. It's fascinating and really also inspiring. Two questions, and I guess you could answer, Rosalie, Shelley, Lynn, you can answer one or both. One question is relating to what you said, Rosalie. You took the words out of my mouth in terms of, the Jewish element and dimension of the amazing work that both of you do, all three of you do. And if you can think of one, I mean, you just spoke very inspiringly about, Shabbos and community and tefillin and continuity. If you could think about what's one Jewish teaching or one maybe episode in Chumash that really resonates with you, that's one question. The second question I had is that you both spoke about, especially, Rosalie, you spoke about passionately about our responsibility to support Israel and the disturbing, concerning trend, especially among the young, among the young community. And so that was spoken about quite a bit. And if you had 30 seconds with a young adult member of the Jewish community who is not supportive of Israel, who kind of takes Israel for granted, and you had 30 seconds to kind of like speak to him and have his ear to try to get him to rethink his or her views, what would you say? What would you say to that a young Jewish millennial in America today about Israel?
Well, I mean,
you could answer either one.
That's an extremely tough question. And I think it's a very important question. And I think what I would say to them, that Jews lived in Europe. My father came from Vilna. My mother came from Riga, and they were kicked out. They were either murdered or kicked out. People lived in Syria. They lived in every country, and they were kicked out. Jews have lived everywhere, and they thought that was their home. They thought they would live there forever. And the real home of the Jewish people is only one place. It's Eretz Yisrael, with the capital of Yerushalayim. And if Jews think for 1 minute that we are safe anywhere else in the world for any length of time, notwithstanding the fabulous life we all have in America, like the fabulous life the Jews had in South Africa, the fabulous lives they had in France, the fabulous lives they had all over the world. Israel is our home. Israel is the place we will always have. It's the place of our ancestors, the place of the forefathers, and we have to be sure that Israel will be there for you, to you, the young person, and for your children and for your grandchildren. And you have to understand that Israel is a democracy, and you will never agree with all of its policies, as I never will. But you have to understand that love and support of Israel is paramount to the Jewish continuity.
And I would say, Rabbi, that you're not going to convince anyone in 30 seconds. Any millennial who feels that way, You're not going to talk to him or her and change her mind. I think the only chance is if you get them to go to Israel.
Yeah, that was.
Get them. They have to go to Birthright. They have to go on Birthright. Even maybe they have to have an experience that will change their mind. Whether it's maybe coming to your home for Shabbat for a meal,
Going to Israel, you're right.
or going
Yeah,
to Israel with the right program. That's their only chance.
Going to Israel.
I would agree to go to Israel, but also to develop that personal relationship. I also think,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, a person who's set in his ways,
Yeah.
you know, then it's going to be hard to convince him. But I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of people who are just uninformed, and they need us perhaps to be a little more articulate and passionate in expressing these views, like that was just expressed.
Yeah, but I think, you know, there's a saying, tell me something, I may not remember it. Teach me something I may not learn. Make me feel something, I'll remember it forever. And I think that's about the experience. When you go to Israel, that is something that you will feel,
Right.
and create that love. It's the experience that really is so incredibly bonding.
Right.
And I think something from Jewish, to answer your question, one of the things that I think is so important is do unto others as you'd want done unto yourself. And we now say, do unto others as they'd want done unto themselves, because what might be okay for someone might not be okay for someone else. But I think it's really true. It's treating people with respect and listening and learning and growing together and finding your commonality versus your differences, because there's something we all have in common. And so finding that and working on the positive and the proactive solutions versus the defensive and what's wrong, looking at what's right and treating each other that way. That's how change happens, and that's how we can create more love in this world for one another. I just have to say, Suzanne, Lynn is asking a question. Suzanne Spiro wants Bubby to answer this question that the Shanlings asked. Did you find Reagan a big fan of Israel?
Was Reagan a fan of Israel?
Yes, Reagan was a very big fan of Israel. And I must say, like all Jews in my generation, they believed in the Democratic Party because they used to say Die Welt and the next Welt and Roosevelt. And we only later found out what Roosevelt could have done to help the Jews, and he didn't. And yes, Ronald Reagan was a great supporter of the state of Israel. And one of the great people in the history of Israel was Eisenhower. He was wonderful in terms of the Jewish community.
But you worked with Reagan and Bush.
I worked for Reagan and Bush the father.
And Pete Wilson.
And I became very disillusioned with the father because of the loan guarantees. And then when Stuart Spencer asked me to work in Bush the Junior administration, who turned out to be a good friend of Israel, I declined because I was afraid that he would not be a friend of Israel. So that was a miscalculation I made.
Is there another question, Shell?
Well, we are at 8:30, and I know everyone has either eaten dinner or is trying to eat dinner.
Okay.
If there's one more pressing question, you know, let us know. And I just have to say to you, Linny and Mom, you're doing great. This is Lynn and my mom to Zoom very often. So I wasn't sure how this was going to work itself out, but pretty good. And Rabbi Cobb, thank you for all that
Thank you, Rabbi.
And to the whole Beth Jacob team for including us in this conversation. I think we could keep telling stories.
Yeah.
We could keep going.
We'll be invited back. We'll do another Beth Jacob's Got Talent for you.
Next time at the Beth Jacob pulpit in Chappelle's Sanctuary.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Thank you. Thanks to the entire Beth Jacob community and family.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Amazing conversation.